Thank you, Matt. Not entirely sure about the sincerity of that introduction. I don't know how well rehearsed that was. So yeah, massive thanks for everyone for being here. What I want to do is take you through, as Matt said, a sort of composite of our research across specific telephony enablement markets, and I'll come on to exactly what we mean by telephony enablement markets and how we define those from a Cavell perspective. But first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about the research, and as Matt said, I joined Cavell coming up for 5 years next year, and since then we have, not just thanks to me, although mainly thanks to me, we've massively diversified the research portfolio, but that actually has been driven by you in the audience, our customers, and that has been absolutely vital to diversifying that research across a number of key areas outside of our traditional area of expertise, which would have been cloud communications. So we've moved into customer experience as an umbrella term, which covers contact center and informal customer experience solutions, Microsoft specifically, the Microsoft ecosystem, and we augment all of those research coverage areas as well as research around emerging technologies in 3 ways, and I think that's the key to a really rounded research portfolio. Firstly, industry insight that we get back from everyone in this room, and I think that is absolutely vital. The feedback that we get from industry, the insights that we get from service providers and telcos and the vendors is the key pillar of that research. We augment that with enterprise-focused research. So every year, my colleague Finbar runs our enterprise research. We survey thousands of businesses across North America and Western Europe to ask about their uses of technology, their plans for adoption, and that leads our strategy in terms of research. And finally, also increasingly end-user research. So whether that's research that comes from consumers, whether it comes from technology users within a business, or whether it comes from contact center agents, the way end users use technology is really key. So it's those 3 pillars of how we access our research across the different technology areas. What I wanted to talk specifically about today, though, was telephony enablement markets. And I'll come on to, as I said, how we define those. But I think there's 3 key trends within communications that we can't ignore that underpin some of the things that I want to talk about within enablement markets. I've gone early with this. Normally try to hold off on artificial intelligence as long as possible in a tech conference, but I've gone first slide. So I think we can't ignore the impact AI is going to have, and particularly within enablement markets, we'll be joined by Microsoft, obviously with Copilot, Zoom with AI Companion later on, Cisco with the AI capability in Webex. And the stat on the left comes from our enterprise-focused research. So 92% of the organizations that we've surveyed have either deployed, are deploying, or are trialing some form of artificial intelligence within their technology stack. So that's almost universal uptake of artificial intelligence technology, and that's going to have an impact across the tech stack. How do you create value around AI? What's the commercial model? Who are your primary partners? I think that's a key consideration for the entire communications industry. We've also seen a real pivot towards customer experience. And again, I'm using customer experience as that umbrella term to cover contact center and informal contact center solutions. And the stat up there is from the same enterprise research study. So more than 1/5 of businesses say that improving customer services is a top strategic priority. And what we've seen is that reflection in the industry is a pivoting away from traditional, not necessarily away from, but in order to add into the portfolio, contact center solutions and customer experience solutions. And the reason for that is the potential margin and revenue streams associated with contact center or even informal contact center solutions outweigh those in traditional UCaaS or telephony solutions. So we've seen the whole industry pivot towards customer experience. And the final one here, in terms of market segmentation, and I know I'm going to talk to Microsoft and Cisco and Zoom about this in a little bit. I think the market segmentation piece is really interesting. How do you segment the market and what are your particular targets? And the stat on screen is from our service provider research, which many of the people in the audience took part in, and we're eternally grateful for that. And that is that we see strategic targeting of businesses of different sizes and verticals. But one of the things that we've seen highlighted, particularly over the last 12 months, is a real focus on how do you address the SME segment. And it depends on your definition, but if you talk of organizations with less than 250 employees, how do you access that section of the market? So as the market becomes more competitive, how do you squeeze every bit of possible revenue out of potential smaller customers that might provide an opportunity? So those are three trends that I want to talk about and how they're going to influence enablement markets in the future. What do we mean by enablement markets, though? As Matt said, I think we were one of the first, Cavell were one of the first companies to use this term. And what we see as enablement market, a more structured version of traditional BYOC. So in a BYOC model, there was less contractual technical agreements between the provider of PSTN telephony services and the vendor themselves. What we're seeing in these BYOC markets is the vendors create a much more structured framework through some of the things that I've put on screen in terms of this high-level topology, which in theory allow and enable PSTN providers in a more structured fashion to enable telephony in key platforms. So at the moment, we're primarily seeing this in collaboration platforms, so I've highlighted them here, Microsoft Operator Connect, Zoom Provider Exchange, and Cisco Cloud Connect. But we are talking, we've heard CCaaS providers look at this, we've talked to the CRM providers who are also exploring this model, a way of easily adding PSTN capability into those software platforms. So why is this happening? So there's key drivers, both from the enterprise level, the platform provider themselves, and also the partner and the service provider. What I wanted to particularly highlight here and look on in this slide is from the platform providers themselves. So if you're a Microsoft, if you're a Zoom, if you're a Cisco, why are you offering this? Well, effectively, you want to be able to allow users to add PSTN capability into these platforms as easily as possible, as quickly as possible, and in as many locations as possible. And you don't necessarily want to go through the potential rigmarole and regulatory and compliance concerns of each country. How do you do that? You leverage partners. I'm going to deep dive into the enterprise and the service provider drivers in a minute, but one of the things that I'll be asking Microsoft, Zoom, and Cisco is, what is their rationale? Is it what I'm talking about in terms of that ability to add PSTN capability for users? So we'll cover that in the panel shortly. And what those drivers have led to are these telephony marketplaces, these enablement marketplaces, Zoom Provider Exchange, Operator Connect, Cisco Cloud Connect. Let's dive into the enterprise drivers in a little bit more detail. So the graph on screen comes from our enterprise research. So this is a study of more than 2,000 businesses across North America and Western Europe. And what we asked, what are your strategic priorities for your communications over the next 3 years? And what you can infer from that data are what are some of the key challenges that businesses are facing. And as might not be a massive surprise, every time we do enterprise research, cost reduction is always up there. So no matter what you're talking about, no matter what technologies you're talking about, the cost of it and the bottom line never goes away. It always tends to be in the top 3 in terms of considerations from a business perspective. So all of the emerging technology that we're talking about, and AI is number 2 on the list, is great, but ultimately we have to be focused and on the bottom line, ensuring that it's cost effective for businesses. In terms of the use of AI, Finbar, my colleague, as I said, has done a lot of work in this space. When we ask enterprises what their main desired benefits are from AI, they're pretty generic. They want to improve productivity and efficiency. They want to make things easier for users, and they want the level of output to increase. I think when you start to look into individual use cases, that's on us as the technology industry to provide those particular use cases and examples of what businesses are going to do, because they don't necessarily understand the art of the possible. And obviously we'll be talking about Zoom AI Companion and Webex AI and Microsoft Copilot in more detail about what some of those use cases are. And finally, and this has ramped up the list in recent years, is focus on cybersecurity and compliance. And I think there is a correlation there between market awareness and the discussion around AI, and we all realize how important the underlying data is for artificial intelligence and machine learning models, and that has heightened enterprise focus on security and compliance. You have to make sure that that data is secure, it's sovereign to your particular region, you're compliant with different regulations in your specific country. So a host of enterprise challenges there. I've just covered off the top 3. What do telephony enablement markets address when it comes to these challenges from an enterprise perspective? So first of all, they offer easy access to a competitive market. The premise of these enablement marketplaces is, as a business user or as an admin, I can go through the system itself and easily deploy telephony services, and I can see a host of options there, immediately giving me access to a competitive market that should regulate itself in terms of the commercials. So from a customer perspective, addressing that number one challenge, thing that they're thinking about in terms of reduction of costs, enablement markets immediately should address those from an enterprise perspective. In theory, enablement markets should provide simpler administration and management. Now, I think we know that hasn't always been the case. There's been some problems in automation in several layers of the process, but the premise is that from an enterprise perspective, it should be easier to administer and manage those. You can obviously maintain existing relationships with potential carriers that you already have and bring them into your enablement world, and I think that offers enterprises a lot of benefits. In theory, you should be able to deploy more quickly. It's simpler. A lot of the technical constraint is taken away from the enterprise or the end admin and is put onto the service provider and the platform vendor. And I think the final one, which is a really key piece, and this comes back in our enterprise research very regularly, are problems and concerns around support and SLA. And in theory, these enablement markets, and I keep on saying in theory because it doesn't always happen in practice, they enable much more enhanced support because of that alignment between the technology platform provider, the vendor themselves, and the service provider. And that should allow for easier issue identification, location, and resolution. So that enhanced support piece is key there. So those are some of the enterprise drivers and how enablement markets address them and why we're seeing that demand in the market for them. Let's have a look from the service provider perspective. And I've spoken to many of you in the audience about this, and I actually think that the narrative for the driver from the service provider perspective is less strong than it is from the enterprise side, and I'll talk a little bit about why I think that. So again, what I've highlighted here are, and many of you in the room took part in this research, what are the biggest challenges you face when targeting your target market? Number one, the competitive landscape. As we've seen, traditional telephony markets, UCaaS markets, getting increasingly competitive around the world. Even though we've seen convergence due to merger and acquisition, those markets becoming increasingly competitive. And what that leads to is commoditization and price degradation as markets become more competitive. So that competitive landscape, one of the key challenges. Customer retention acquisition, how do you find new customers? How do you keep the ones you've got? How do you layer on additional services to make that customer transition more difficult? A key consideration. And the number 3 on the list here, product differentiation. I think this is really interesting in enablement markets. If you're all taking a Zoom platform, for example, how do you differentiate on the product when you're all offering the same platform? I think that's a key challenge, and the differentiation has to come in other areas of the portfolio. So those are some of the challenges that we see from a service provider perspective. How do telephony enablement markets address some of those service provider challenges? Well, I think the top priority, and I should have weighted this because I think access to customers is the overwhelming rationale that we see of why we see service providers join these markets. And I'll come on to a bit more detail in terms of the size of how many users there are in the different models. But access to customers, by joining Microsoft Operator Connect or Zoom Provider Exchange or Cloud Connect, you get access to a potential pool of customers that you can leverage for services. Through these enablement models, you should get better alignment with the technology platform provider themselves. Because of that more highly structured agreement that we talked about, both contractually and technically, you should be able to better align with the platform provider in terms of strategy. It provides a migration opportunity, and we've heard this repeatedly in our enterprise research. Still, depending on what market you look at, in the US, we're at sort of over 50% penetration of cloud-based technologies into the overall business telephony base. Similar in the UK, there's still a really substantial proportion of the market on premises-based solutions. And these enablement markets, because of the simplicity from an end-user perspective, should offer an accelerated migration option. From a provider perspective, it does enable global expansion. You don't have to spin up your own soft switch in every country that you want to add service to. You can utilize the global platform providers. However, I realize there are other constraints around regulatory and compliance concerns of setting up as a provider in each of those countries. And the final one, we think this aligns with a more holistic business strategy in terms of technology provision. So if you think of the telephony services within these enablement markets as one aspect of an overall technology portfolio that might include a host of other services, value-added services, professional and managed services, we think that effectively providing these telephony services just becomes a proportion of a more rounded technology portfolio. But as I said, I think the case for enablement markets from an enterprise perspective is stronger than the service provider perspective, and we'll talk about that later on with the vendors. So, where are we now in terms of enablement markets? We were running the numbers from last year in terms of how many providers, and we're looking at the three primary providers here. So Zoom Provider Exchange, Microsoft Operator Connect, and Webex Cloud Connect. And when we did the event last year, as you can see, 39 providers on Zoom, 72 on OC, 22 on Webex Cloud Connect. As you can see, this is just 12 months on, pretty significant growth in terms of the number of providers on those platforms. So even though I talked about the rationale from a service provider perspective maybe not being as strong as the enterprise perspective, we're still seeing overwhelming demand for providers to join these enablement markets. And I think it's primarily for that number one reason I talked about, that access to that customer base. So really significant growth we've seen across the different platforms. Now, I think that the really interesting thing is here, most of you who were here last year will remember we did a Venn diagram of the different logos of all the providers that were within the different models. Now, I've got to be honest, we tried to do it with the logos this year. There's too many logos, we can't fit them on the slide. So what I'd like to talk you through, the Venn diagram on the left looks at the number of, so this is last year, looks at the number of providers within each platform, and then what we're really interested in is the overlap. So the number of providers that, for example, are on Zoom Provider Exchange, Webex Cloud Connect, and Microsoft Operator Connect. So if we move forward to the graph on the right for this year, as you can see, there's been an increase across the board, as we showed on the last slide, in terms of providers joining these programs. But really significantly, what we're seeing is an increase in the areas of overlap. So more and more providers want to have a multi-vendor technology enablement strategy. And I don't think that necessarily reflects enterprise demand. We do see some particularly large enterprises want to have a multi-vendor collaboration estate, but generally that tends to be very large enterprises or multinational organizations where they have a particular requirement for a different collaboration solution in a different region. I don't think this reflects enterprise demand. I think this reflects service provider demand. And going back to that initial slide where I talked about segmentation, I think service providers, and I'd be interested for feedback from anyone in the audience, of taking different vendor solutions to different proportions of the market. And I think we're only likely to see this increase. More and more service providers wanting to be part of multiple enablement programs so they have as many technology offerings as possible as they can manage to take to different parts of the market. So, in terms of the raw numbers, I just thought we'd look specifically at the PSTN-enabled telephony users in these 3 collaboration platforms. So, Zoom, nearly 8 million users, and these are our Cavell numbers. These aren't the published numbers from the vendors. These are our Cavell numbers. If you're interested in any more detail, please do let me know. And this is of Q2 2024. Nearly 8 million Zoom users we're tracking, more than 16 million Webex call, and that's Webex calling specifically, not on the other Cisco platforms. And Microsoft announced earlier this year their public announcement was for 20 million PSTN-enabled users. Our forecast at this, we think by now it'll probably be around 23 million. I was looking at Tamor there for any sort of indication. I know he can't give anything away, but that's on our forecast. So going back to that point about the driver being the customer access, everybody is after a piece of this user pie, and it's a really significant proportion, and that's why we're seeing service providers flock to these platforms. That is pretty much all from me. Just a final sort of shameless plug for a few Cavell things. Channel insights. So I talked about that market segmentation piece. At Cavell, we realized we had a shortfall of research around the channel. We realized that a couple of years ago, and we have developed a platform where we're covering more than 85,000 providers globally, 35,000 providers within the US and the UK, and through the platform, you can analyze those 35,000 providers over what services they talk about on their websites, what vendors they support, what industries they target. So if you're interested in a channel go-to-market, that tool, I think, could be really valuable. And you can see a demo of it on the Cavell booth. As Matt said, that's on the other side of the floor. The events calendar, we are launching Cavell Summit APAC, which will take place at the end of February. What I would request is that as many people as possible ask for questions about the enablement markets there, so I definitely get on that trip to Sydney. That would be really useful. And we'll be back in London on the 12th of March for Cavell Summit Europe. And finally, a few research pieces that we've published recently. Our Microsoft reports, our service provider report, which is feedback from service providers, our enterprise insight, which is a study of hundreds of buyers across North America and Western Europe. We run the same, my colleague Finbar runs that across customer experience and contact center. So if you're interested in finding out how many contact center users there are in any particular country, we can cover that with our customer experience reports. And finally, the data that I showed in this report in terms of the number of telephony-enabled users, we cover that for individual countries, and we break that down into much more detail. So if you're interested in that in the US or France or Italy, you can get that as part of our cloud comms market reports. So that is it from me. I think now I'm going to introduce, if he's all mic'd up and ready, Tamor Hussain, Global Business Manager from Microsoft, to talk about the future of work. Tamor, over to you. Pleasure.